Okay, Nate, we are good.
Hey everyone, I'm Nate McGackey. I'm Executive Director of Arts North Carolina, and thank you for coming out for another edition of What the Federal is Happening. This is a lot has been going on over the last few weeks, so I definitely want to catch everybody up. Just a precursor. I do the slides for this presentation are already on our website at artsnorthcarolina.org, excuse me, artsnc.org. You can, under advocacy, you can go to ArtsNC webinars. The slides are posted. So if you want to follow along that way, you have that ability. And I do try to make these slides so that they're an easy to read reference after the fact as well. Also, that is my email and phone number. I encourage you to, I'm great at answering questions via email. So please reach out if we don't answer all of your questions during the webinar. Bit of a disclaimer, I am not a lawyer, so I am definitely not your lawyer. So this is not legal advice. We may be talking about grants, but that does not necessarily mean that you should consider that legal advice for your grants or your organizations. I know that we have a lot of questions and everybody's really interested in what's going on with the National Endowment for the Arts, and we are going to talk about them. But I want to give you guys an update on the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Humanities, because some things are going on there, but also because it kind of puts what's happening at the NEA into context. Also, a little bit of an update on where we are with DEI and gender ideology, and then
Can
we'll
you hang on
definitely.
just a second, Nate?
Sure.
Tabitha, do you have eyes on our Facebook page and you can actually see the video working?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Great.
Just checking.
So, and then we will move into those terminated and withdrawn NEA grants, and we will then dive into the federal budget. And then we will definitely be talking about the kind of advocacy that you can do. So, overview of the federal agencies, federal cultural agencies, IMLS, NEH, and NEA. You can see IMLS, 295 million. Over 70% of that goes to state governments. There's state grants that go to fund library programs. That is 70% of what the IMLS does. Humanities and national endowments have always had parity in their budgets. It's always been the same number. 40% of the NEH funds go to state humanities councils. Those are nonprofit organizations, and 40% of the NEA funds go to state arts agencies like the North Carolina Arts Council, as well as regional arts organizations. With the exception of Vermont, all of those state arts agencies are government entities. So that might play out, be a main difference between those nonprofit humanities councils and those government arts agencies. So, what we know about IMLS, most of this is news that we covered in the last webinar. There was an executive order eliminating IMLS. Then, a few days later, they named Deputy Secretary of Labor Keith Sonderling to a second job as IMLS director. The entirety of the IMLS staff got placed on administrative leave. Some grants started to get canceled, though there's some questions about how many of those grants are canceled, and I haven't been able to find a good resource on that, or if anybody's been able to track all of that. I know for a fact there was a Freedom of Information Act request put in that has yet to be answered. Termination notices were sent to all but 12 IMLS staff. All 23 members of the Museum and Library Services Board were fired. And we know that some states have received their IMLS grants to state. That's those big library grants. But we also know that some were specifically canceled, particularly the very blue states of California, Connecticut, and Washington. I'll also just let you know where North Carolina falls in this. North Carolina receives over $5 million in grants for that library grant. That one grant for libraries is over $5 million that goes to the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. services, and then there's another $2 million plus that go to other organizations in North Carolina. So just so you know, there's two lawsuits going on. One was filed by 21 states attorneys general for the illegal action several times over. Another one came a few days later that was filed by the American Library Association alongside the American Federation of States and the county and municipal employees. Um, the judge in the ALA lawsuit, that's the American Library Association lawsuit, issued a temporary restraining order on May 1st, and then the judge for the one that was brought by the 21 state attorneys general issued a preliminary injunction. Again, not a lawyer, so I cannot explain to you the difference between a preliminary injunction and a temporary restraining order, but I can tell you what the judge was saying. Um, Justifications for eliminating the programs, terminating grants, and implementing large-scale employee RIFs, that's reduction in force, have been couched in mere conclusory statements. The defendants have not shown, that would be the federal government, and specifically IMLS, the current IMLS director, have not shown an analysis was conducted to determine which components and functions of IMLS are statutorily required and which are not required. And so the judge also said that the plaintiffs had a very strong likelihood of success. So that's what we know about the IMLS lawsuit. Here's what we know about the National Endowment for the Humanities. So in very early April, they placed 80% of the National Endowment staff on administrative leave. And then went about canceling over 1,000 grants, including all of those grants to the state humanities councils, right? So remember, that's like, probably that's a significant amount of money going to those nonprofit humanities council, as well as we heard reports that they were going to claw back any unspent funds all the way back to 2021. Now, some good news in this story since this happened towards the end of April. The Mellon Foundation committed $15 million for the humanities councils. So it was about a $65 million cut. So that's what they lost. North Carolina's Humanities Councils gets 1.6 million of that. But the Mellon Foundation is going to be about $250,000 to the North Carolina Humanities Council. So not all of that money back. So 250 out of that 1.6 that they lost, but 200,000 of that is immediate, and then 50,000 they've got to raise matching funds to get that. So kind of a lifeline there, particularly while the lawsuits are going into effect. So a few days after Mellon made their announcement, the American Council of Learned Societies, American Historical Association, and the Modern Language Association filed a federal lawsuit challenging the illegal dismantling of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The hope was to reverse all these actions by the National Endowment for the Humanities, including both the termination of the 1,000 grants, suspension of entire divisions, and the dismissal of approximately 65% of its staff. So of that 80% that got put on administrative leave, I guess 65% of that staff was that. Also, I will say that towards the end of April, before Mellon and the lawsuit came out, we heard from the NEH. There's a posting on their website that the NEA and NEH were putting in combined $34 million. So we're figuring 17 million from the NEH and 17 million from the NEA for the Garden of Heroes. And that's going to be a statuary garden of American heroes that has been a pet project of President Trump for a while. So there's information on the NEH's website about that proposed project, and there's been some reporting on it as well. So before we dive into everything NEA, let's kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about these executive orders just briefly. Three executive orders that directly impacted the National Endowment for the Arts that we've been dealing with. One is the the defending women and gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. This is known as the gender ideology DE or the gender ideology executive order. Basically said that the feds only recognize two genders. Federal dollars cannot fund anything that promotes gender ideology, meaning anything that recognizes anything other than male or female as assigned at birth. And it also rescinded a ton of rules and guidance the federal government had on transgender people and how they're addressed in the federal government. Also, there's the ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, known as the anti-DEI executive order. It's basically said that any federal grantee has to certify that they don't engage in illegal DEI practices. Not any DEI practice, but it does specifically say illegal, and that's really important as we move forward. It also ends all federal DEI programs, says federal money can't be used for DEI programs, and direct federal agencies need to start working towards ending DEI in the private sector without specifics. It also said that the NEA, NEH, and IMLS were going to be included in a task force celebrating America's 250th birthday. And we heard that. We were really hopeful that we wouldn't see massive cuts in those agencies, but as we know now, that was not necessarily a guarantee. Now, the NEA addressed those executive orders. They had a round of grants for arts projects applications that were due on April 7th. So they changed their assurance of compliance, things that you have to sign and agree to in order to apply for an NEA grant. This has been around forever. Lots of federal legislation, Civil Rights Act, et cetera, on there. It said that the applicant's going to comply with executive orders, that the applicant that based on that more or less what it said is that the federal government is not going to fund projects that that promote DEI, or they're not going to do DEI programs funding with direct dollars, and that you can't have a program outside of your grant project that violates any applicable law. And so that was sort of the bright line that they had for DEI, was that we don't fund DEI at all. And you can do EEI, but your organization has to not do illegal DEI. It also said that federal funds can't be used to promote gender ideology in accordance with the executive order. So, all of these have had some legal action since then. Back in February, there was a court injunction that paused the DEI executive order. NEA changed that compliance, assurance of compliance, to say that you didn't need to certify while the injunction was in effect. In mid-March, the appeals court lifted the injunction. NEA never changed the assurance of compliance and didn't ask anybody to sign anything saying that they wouldn't do DEI. Out of their Q&A, we can see that that projects can reach a certain group or demographic, depending on sex, disability, economic status, race, color, national origin, but you can't exclude. So you can serve a Latino community, but you can't exclude a white participant from participating. So and that they advise that you make your application very clear that the project activities are not exclusionary. And so that's sort of the line and where we've landed on the DEI executive order. On the gender executive order, so there was a lawsuit in early March filed by the Rhode Island ACLU on behalf of Rhode Island Latino Arts, the Theater Offensive, National Queer Theater, and the Theater Communications Group against the NEA, saying that it violated the First Amendment. The gender ideology executive order violated their First Amendment rights because it restricted artistic expression and imposed a viewpoint. The Fifth Amendment because violated due process, as well as the Administrative Procedures Act for arbitrary changes. The NEA changed their assurance of compliance that said they weren't going to require anybody to certify anything while the lawsuit was going through. ACLU tried to block them from continuing to take applications on April 7th because the NEA had said that they weren't going to come up with guidance on how they were going to address the this particular executive order until April 30th. The court refused to expressly block the NEA from reimposing the ban and for opening that up, but they agreed that the NEA funding ban for projects promoting gender ideology would likely be determined to be violating the First Amendment. So that was sort of a preliminary reason. So now we can move forward. The NEA did release very late on April 30th a new it's several pages long. If you want to read it, you can use that link. Their new policy, which basically is that they are not going to require anybody to promote gender ideology. So there is no bar in place to inhibit an application. And I will say that this particular policy is very geared towards making sure that, that it's kind of answering a lot of things that are brought up in the lawsuit. So it's very much designed around answering the lawsuit. So you don't have to say you won't promote gender ideology, and the chair is going to evaluate whether each recommended grant does or does not promote it into ideology. And in her sole discretion, or his, depending if things change, award or decline to award based on this and other criteria, right? So it is all going to lay in the hands and at the feet of the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. Also, applicants' other activities behind the walls of, outside of those four walls of the project itself, will not be considered in the application. So, if you are an organization that is applying for grant funding for a project for an after school program, but then you also host a drag show, that drag show is not going to disqualify you. So the organization can promote gender ideology, but it elsewhere in its programming, but not in the project that's being funded. Just recently, the ACLU put out their response statement. I think this was yesterday. It was a more official response where they said the NEA's notice does very little to assuage any fears that artists or organizations may have that their project applications will be judged on arbitrary and vague ideology metrics rather than artistic merit. As a result, we will continue to seek judicial relief to protect free speech rights. So this is still ongoing, and I'm sure that we'll continue to hear more about that. So that's all the court cases. Let's talk a little bit about the staff reductions. Now that happened a little over a week ago, last Monday. We know that the announcement started going out on Monday, but staff knew about this ahead of time. Right now, we're estimating that between 50 to 55% of the NEA staff will still be there on May 31st. So everybody that's all the announcements have gone out have said their last day will be May 31st of this year. The thing is, and we've talked about this before, Mary Ann Carter has been working to reduce staff positions and reduce the size of the NEA since she came on on January 20th. Mary Ann Carter is right now acting as the director for the NEA. Nobody at the NEA got fired. So as you're having conversations about this, just remember there was not terminations, there was not firings, nobody was put on administrative leave. Unlike at NEH and IMLS and other situations you've heard in this government, this was all voluntary. Some staff took deferred resignations. That's probably going to, give them salary for several months after May 5th. I do not know the details of that. Other, if they were qualified, took early retirement. So you had to have 20 plus years with the federal government and be over 50 in order to qualify that. All the discipline directors are departing, right? So really, the leadership of NEA is going to be gone. Some of the departments within the National Endowment lost all their staff or are losing all of their staff in the transition. Also, the next day on Congress.gov, nomination was shown up for consideration of Mary Ann Carter, which she was nominated to be the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts again. Oddly, Washington Post had a list that said she was nominated to be chair of the NEA and the NEH, but that is not what is on the actual government websites. So and this is, like I said, she was chair during the first Trump administration, and she has a lot of relationships and really understands the agencies. My big question right now that I can't answer entirely. So if there is lawsuits, um, and federal courts get involved, I don't know that those staff that left and took these voluntary departures can be reinstated by lawsuit because they were voluntary and they were not placed on leave or subject to a reduction in force order. So, but we will see how that plays out at the NEA, and but obviously a little less jarring than some of the staffing changes at NEH and IMLS. So let's talk a little bit about the grant terminations and withdrawals, and let's talk about what they are and what they're not, and make sure that we're really kind of being careful about how we talk about this. So after 5 o'clock on Friday, May 2nd, we started seeing grant notices go out by email to several folks that had received National Endowment for the Arts grants. From what I've been able to tell, they were mostly from the two grant rounds of FY24 round two and FY21-25 round one. So there were two types of notifications went out. There were active grants that had been terminated, right? So those were grants that sort of already in process, basically said that as of May 31st, your grant is terminated, and that now becomes your new project period end date. So if you had a project that was happening, that the project date at the NEA was January 1 to June 30, it's now January 1 to 5/31. You did have to the end till June 30th to put in payment requests for expenses for the project that happened before May 31st. You could file through June 30th, and then your final financial report was due on June 31st. Now, the second type of notification went out was a withdrawal of grant offers, right? So these were offers that had gone out and that had been accepted, and the people were planning and had in their budget, but the grant offers were withdrawn. I will say that many of these terminated grants were all of the money had already been received. But there was a deadline for appeal. So everyone had 7 days to appeal this to the grants at arts.gov webs or email address, with no timeline provided on when you might hear back. And there were several folks that were partway through their grants or a multi-year grant, things of that nature. And then last night, I started getting texts around 5 o'clock because we found out that 276 National Endowment for the Arts grant notices were sent out after 4 p.m. Eastern time. I've heard these numbers from several places. So of those 276 notices, 186 were terminations. And those terminations were going to be effective on June 15th. So 2 weeks later than the terminations before. Also, 128 of that 186, they had already received all their funds, right? So most of those grants had already received the funds. The two that I definitely know about in North Carolina also had received their funds. 90 of those, and this was new, were expedited closeouts, which basically said, you've got to do your financial report, but we're just going to close you out as quickly as possible, and really make your reporting requirements a lot easier. So it seems like they're really trying to get everything closed out by July 31st. And of course, there is a deadline to appeal. And I made sure that everybody that may have received one of those from those last two grant cycles got all of those. Got all of those same appeal resources that I had sent to the other tracked canceled grantees. If you've already received all your money, you don't have to appeal unless you want to be on the record. I heard from someone who's talking to somebody inside the NEA today that there's currently no plans to track down that funding, and that you really just need to close that out. and not worry about if you already have your money, you don't need to appeal. But I know that we've been advising folks to appeal and to go ahead and get on the record appealing the decision to terminate your grant. But that is entirely up to each individual organization. No state arts agency or regional arts organization partnership has been canceled. So for those of you that know how it works, the NEA gets about 40% of their budget, like I said, out to those state arts agencies. In North Carolina, that means about $1.2 million going to the North Carolina Arts Council. None of those grants in any of the states, including North Carolina, they have not been affected. I know a lot of folks are worried about grassroots grants and things of that nature. Grassroots grants comes from a totally separate part of the state budget that is completely state funded, and federal dollars don't touch grassroots grants at all. They do fund some other grants in the general grant category, but none of that has been impacted. And I will let everyone know, we Arts NC will definitely let you know we're keeping a very close eye on that. But I've gotten a lot of questions about that, so I want to make it really clear. So what about the grants that did get canceled in North Carolina? I'd say that about 250,000 were withdrawn grants. That's money that is not coming out, whereas over 250, probably over 300 now, thousand were terminated, but the funding had already been received. So we're about $500,000 in grants that have received termination notices, but about half of that, maybe a little more than half of that now have already received the funding. New priorities were provided in that messaging to the NEA. And I'm going to go over that, but also just as a note, that $17 million for NEA savings and NEH savings, so some of this canceled money is probably being redirected into that Garden of Heroes. But what did they say in the grant making process? I will say that these new priorities are not posted anywhere that I can find on the NEA website, right? This has only been seen in these terminations and withdrawal notices. But the NEA is updating its grant making policy priorities to focus on funding on projects that reflect the nation's rich artistic heritage and creativity as prioritized by the president. So the NEA is now going to prioritize projects that elevate the nation's HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, celebrate the 250th anniversary of American independence, foster AI competency, empower houses of worship to serve communities, assist with disaster recovery, foster skilled trade jobs, make America healthy again, support the military and veterans, support tribal communities, make the District of Columbia safe and beautiful, and support the economic development of Asian American communities. No mention of artistic excellence and artistic merit, which is in the founding language of the NEA. But also something to note is that all of those priorities have at least one executive order tied to them. So that is, I think, very much a way that the National Endowment for the Arts is trying to make sure that their priorities are aligning with the executive orders from the president. So now that we've talked about what has happened at the NEA, I want to talk a little bit about the budget process and what's going to be coming up, because there's actually several things going on. And the first two things I want to talk about is rescission and reconciliation. So what is a rescission? A rescission is basically the White House, the president, who is in charge of the executive branch, all the agencies saying, all the money that you allocated, we would like not to spend all of that money. So we're going to put in an official request to Congress, and that is called a rescission. So we heard about a month ago that the White House was going to be sending Congress a $9.4 billion rescission request. We knew that they were going to be targeting the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which gives funding to National Public Radio and the public broadcasting system, as well as all excuse me, television, public television, and as well as USA. We know that those were going to be targets, but it is not impossible when that rescission request comes out that the NEA and the NEH and IMLS could be targeted. We have not heard that yet, but if it's money that they're not going to spend, we don't know. We have not seen that request. It was expected in late April, but to my knowledge, it has not been sent. Also, something that's really important to know: rescission only requires 51 votes, or 50 votes in the Senate plus a tie-breaking vote of the Vice President Vance. Most bills in the Senate need what's called cloture in order to move forward, which is a 60 vote minimum. What does this mean? It means that if Republicans decide that this is something that they want to move forward, that they would be able to do that without any Democrats, which they cannot do for most bills in the Senate. They need some Democrats to come on board to get to that 60 for cloture, but they do not need any Democrats to do that, because obviously right now the Senate is controlled by Republicans. Um, Reconciliation is going to be happening over the summer, and you might have heard it called the Great Big Beautiful Bill, right? So you can only use the reconciliation process for really three things: spending, revenue, or the debt limit, raising or lowering the debt limit. But it has been used to do a lot of things over the last few years. It's been used to create entitlements. So the Affordable Care Act was an example. It's been used for tax reform. So all the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts that went into effect in 2017, as well as balancing the budget. So lots of different things, have been attached to this because they are related to spending, revenue, or the debt limit. So this reconciliation, we do expect tax reform because we know that the Trump tax cuts from 2017 need to be reauthorized. We do expect, there's lots of arguing about the debt limit within the Republican Party. I know President Trump has said he wants a debt limit raise included in this big bill, but there's some hardline Republicans, particularly in the House, that do not want to raise the debt limit. There is going to be some energy policy involved in this, kind of probably repealing some of the energy policies that the Biden administration saw through with Democrats, and some spending. So we are expected to see increased spending on things like defense and border security measures. We're looking at probably decreased spending on other parts of the federal budget, and that's why we're keeping a close eye on the reconciliation process. It's not impossible that NEA, NEH, and IMLS could be targeted. Again, we have not heard that specifically, or at least I haven't, but it is possible. So, and also, just like rescission, reconciliation only requires 51 votes to pass the Senate, not 60 for closure. So, two things to watch. Again, rescission could be happening at any time now, and that reconciliation we expect to be going through throughout the summer. What about the federal budget for next year? Well, as you know, or as you might know, the federal fiscal year ends at the end of September and starts on October 1st. So officially, they should get the budget passed before the end of September. And they usually just pass continuing resolutions and keep the spending from last year moving until until they do finally agree on a budget compromise. This year they actually just passed a continuing resolution for FY25 that just went all the way through the end of the year, basically kind of not even passing a budget. But on Friday, the May 2nd, oddly just a few hours before the grant cancellations started coming out at the NEA, the White House released a skinny budget. That just means it's a broader overview. It's not the complete budget. But within that skinny budget, it was clear that the Trump administration wanted to eliminate the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is not news, or it's not new. It is news. But President Trump did this 4 times before in his first time. And during that time that he did that, we actually saw some slight increases, even with Republican-controlled Congress. So please keep in mind that this is something we have seen before. However, It's going to be very different this time because before President Trump was putting in his proposal that these agencies that were all fully sized and fully functional needed to be eliminated. Now these agencies have much less staff. Grants are being canceled. There's a lot more question about what's going to be happening in this, depending on how rescission goes or reconciliation. Is that going to strengthen? So all of those things are going to tie into how they approach doing the FY26 budget. There is a dear colleague letter sign on. The due date has already passed. We did have several legislators from North Carolina that signed on. That's basically a letter where members of Congress in the House said, yes, we agree that $209 million is a good request for the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for Humanities. That would be a $2 million increase that we're asking for. But about 100 members signed on out of 435 total. So that's pretty good numbers, right? Probably, we're close to a quarter of the U.S. House of Representatives. And remember, like I said, FY26 doesn't start until October 1st, but those budgets very rarely actually pass before the fiscal year starts. I know many of you lead organizations that you wish you could get away with that, but the budgets, so this could be an ongoing process that could go well into 2026. So what are the big questions that we're wondering about? How is Congress going to budget for these agencies now that they have less staff and they have less, what's going on with these canceled grants? How is Congress going to deal with that in their budget, as well as how they're going to consider it in reconciliation and rescission? What are these lawsuit verdicts going to have to do with it? Are the lawsuit verdicts going to be final before they start working on the budget or before the budget is passed? We know that they might take the cuts into account, but as we know, NEH and IMLS cuts already under injunctions and legal proceedings. Will the staff reinstatements be considered in the budget, right? So if those courts tell folks that they have to rehire all the staff that they laid off, but the budget has been changed to reflect the staff cuts, where does that say? And will the 40% of NEA funds go to state arts agencies? And I think the answer there is yes. But the bigger question is, will there be less or more? And, we were hearing a lot of scuttlebutt and rumors, if there's less staff at the NEA in order to put out all the grants to individual organizations, that might mean they need to give out fewer grants, or that might mean that they are just put more funding through the state agencies. The answer to all of that, we don't know, and all of that is speculation. And we can pontificate, and even if you hear somebody who is in authority that they might be pontificating about what might happen, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. So I think everybody just needs to definitely make sure that before you take action on anything you're hearing, think about whether or not it's fact or speculation, because we all like to speculate how things may move forward. So what should we do about it, right? Well, obviously, we're Arts North Carolina. We are going to advocate several advocacy options. North Carolina has launched our North Carolina Needs the NEA campaign. There is a North Carolina specific email campaign that you can use. So in addition to all of the federal information that we want our congressional representatives to know, there's specific information about the economic impacts of the arts in North Carolina, as well as the impact of the North Carolina Arts Council. So we encourage you to use that. There's also a script for a phone campaign. So feel free to, so it's really easy. You can pull it up on your phone, push the button, it'll dial the phone number, and you have the script right in front of you. Or you can say, other things that you want. It is your congressional representatives. We want you to tell them what's going on with you. Any real life impacts that you're seeing, not speculating, but real impacts that you're seeing from any of these cuts, definitely let your congressional representatives know about that. We also have a sign-on letter, and I really encourage anyone who is particularly, we're looking for arts organizations or arts businesses, arts specific. Um, to sign on to this letter. If you have the ability to sign your organization on, you can't sign on your school if you're a teacher at a school, but you can. But if you run an arts business or you own an arts business or you run an arts nonprofit, we encourage you to sign on this letter that's on our website. Definitely check that out at artsnc.org. We're going to use that to start conversations with our congressional representatives, all of our congressional representatives, 14 in the House and our 2 senators. So we're really encouraging folks to do that in the next few weeks, because as this starts to settle, that's when we're going to start to reach out to our congressional delegation from North Carolina. I also strongly encourage everyone to also go to Americans for the Arts and the Americans for the Arts Action Fund and participate in their Protect the NEA. If you've already done our email, do the American for the Arts and vice versa. Theirs is a national message. It's a different email. There's similarities, yes, but you can use their script. You can use their phone app. It's all on a program called Quorum, so it'll look very similar, but the messaging is a little different and really for mass. And they also have a mail-in letter that you can print out and sign and mail to your elected representatives in Congress. So I encourage everybody to use those campaigns. Performing Arts Alliance also has a great email campaign you can use. And also 3 campaigns down there that are more specific to NEH, IMLS, and libraries. But please, and all of those are ones that we've put out at Arts North Carolina before. I will also say that the Arts NC campaign, as well as the American for the Arts campaign, also encourage the reinstatement of national and NEH and IMLS. But so please, I always say, take 2 minutes to do X, right? Well, take 10 minutes and do all of it. And because we really cannot raise our voice up too little in this moment. Also, this is a link to the policy brief for the National Endowment for the Arts. We actually just updated it this year. I'll make sure that, or this week, I'll make sure that we are sending out that in coming emails once that gets finalized. This is all the talking points that you need in order to advocate for the NEA, and really kind of understand a lot of the programs. We have edited it so it is more geared for a more conservative audience, given who is in power currently in Congress. I will say that I compile this information from a lot of different sources, a lot of different conversations, a lot of different email lists and groups that I'm on. But if you just want to kind of, get what's coming out most recently, Americans for the Arts Action Fund does a great breaking news page there. You can link to it from these slides. All of those little notices are color coded to be from either the executive, congressional, or judicial branches. So you might have to go through a lot of them, like I did, to kind of come up with a timeline for, say, IMLS or NEA. But if you just want to see, something to check every day or two to see what has popped up recently, this is a really great resource because it's set up in a timeline format. So with that. I am happy to take questions about anything that's going on in the federal government, and I will go ahead and stop the screen share. Thank you very much, Ingrid. I appreciate that. Yeah, Raina Campbell, you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi Nate. So sorry. I was thinking about typing, but I'm taking copious notes, so I thought I would just speak up. That last document that you just mentioned, is that something that's available online, or is that something you said you'd be emailing?
So that is so there is a link that is that's on the slide. So if you go to the Arts and C webpage for the webinars, the Arts and C webinars, which is in the advocacy drop down menu, all of these
Mhm.
slides are posted and you can link directly to that document from the slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so
And
much.
as that gets updated, because we're just now finalizing probably later today a version that just had a little bit more tweaking, we'll make sure that we send that out in a future email as well. So definitely keep your eye on that as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Hmm. Any other questions? Anything from Facebook?
Not just yet, but I'm
Okay.
gonna give it a little bit longer and see if anything comes through.
Well, I definitely encourage everybody to make sure that that you are, engaging in advocacy and also, we talk a lot about these email campaigns, we talk about letter writing, all of that is great, but I mean, if you can make the time, go ahead and reach out to your congressional office and and have these conversations, right? Like there's a local congressional office for your House member, your U.S. House member. So you can call them and try and have a one-on-one conversation. You can schedule an appointment. You can do all of those things to take more time. I often highlight the quick and easy advocacy steps, but also having building those relationship and having those conversations. Yes, Cecile.
Okay, thank you for everything, Nate. Is there a true definition from the administration what is considered illegal DEI, or is it just is it just exclusionary?
I will say that the administration has been vague about what illegal DEI is, and I believe that that is so that folks start self-censoring beyond what they have the legal authority to keep from happening. So there are folks that have probably done things in with it, under the banner of DEI that do violate federal law. However, that said, if you have a lawyer on your board, or just any kind of attorney and said, "Hey, is this program illegal?" It is probably not. And also, I will say that most of the administration's rhetoric and the executive orders around DEI, as well as bills that we see here in North Carolina, none of which have passed, but that are focused on DEI, are much more focused on hiring and workplace practices and less focused on reaching out to, say, kids in a Hispanic community, or participation in programming, or how you are programming for your venues or whatever. So it's much more in hiring practices, and generally it seems like they're targeting larger businesses. Harvard University, obviously being kind of the flagship of that in the news. So definitely track those things. But in terms of like all of your DEI programs that an arts organization might run, I do not think most of those, or really any of those, are going to run afoul of what the administration is talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And Nate, we have a question here. Hobie Ford typed in the chat. Do you know if NC Arts Council's Cartwheels grants will be affected?
I do not know off the top of my head all of the grants that are connected, but right now, nothing at the North Carolina Arts Council will be affected by anything. They have not lost any funding. All of the North Carolina Arts Council's funding is through that state partnership, right? That is their NEA funding, and that state partnership has not been canceled. It has not been talked about. The NEA hasn't touched it. So nothing is happening at the North Carolina Arts Council. And I get a lot of questions about that. So I'll restate it really, really simply, right? Like the North Carolina Arts Council has not lost any funding. So as of right now, no North Carolina Arts Council programs are affected. I am keeping a very close eye on when the NEA does, start those partnership agreements. There's going to be, a lot of people are going to be looking at, is there language in there that is implementing executive orders? I work very closely with North Carolina Arts Council leadership. We meet on a weekly basis. We are very much aware of what's going on, and I would rely on the North Carolina Arts Council to proactively inform you if there was anything in there. But as of right now, nothing has happened with the North Carolina Arts Council. Great. Any other questions?
Somebody put the link to that DEI executive order in the
Right, to
chat
the
if
executive
anybody's
order.
interested in actually reading it.
Right.
I just had one come through on Facebook.
Sure.
Let's see. Is funding still secure for South Arts?
That is a really great question. So the answer is yes, but so the yes is that the primary funding, the big grant that South Arts gets as a regional arts organization, that's part of that 40% of the NEA's budget that goes to the state arts agencies as well. That partnership agreement, just like the North Carolina Arts Council, has not been touched. There was a program called Arts Here, and there was NEA funding. It also had private funding. It was several $1 million. I'm not an expert on Arts Here, but it was administered by all 6 of the regional arts organizations, South Arts being one of those. So it was a big grant, and it had a lot of sub grantees. So if you know somebody that said last week, right, that they got an email canceling their NEA grant last week, then it probably came because they had an Arts Here grant, and those were usually smaller organizations that were serving less served communities. Those grants have been, but I don't know exactly what the details are on that, because again, that was a public-private partnership, and the regionals are dealing with those grantees directly because they are sub grantees of the regionals and of South Arts. So, short answer: South Arts not affected right now, but a project that South Arts did was affected and was canceled by the grant.
And one more from Facebook. It says, given where we are, who is strategizing around the new NEA, NEH?
So that is a really great question. I think that it is that we don't know what NEA and NEH is going to look like. I will say that right now, I'm encouraged that they have nominated Marianne Carter to serve as the chair of the NEA. She's been there. She worked at the NEA for 4 years. She is a big supporter of the arts. She has very personal connections to the arts. But that said, she is, she also is, serves at the pleasure of the president, and has made it very clear that the NEA will not be an outlier. The NEA is not going to look different than other federal agencies. It is a federal agency. She's appointed by the president, and so they will be enacting his policies to the best of the ability to align with other federal agencies. All of that said, I work with several groups, one of which I'm co-chair of the Creative States Coalition, which is all of the state organizations. I'm also very active with the Cultural Advocacy Group, which is all the national organizations as well as some of the state organizations that get engaged in federal policy. That group, Marianne Carter came and talked with us this was a month ago, so none of this had happened at that point, but about what was going on. She is nothing else. She is a straight shooter. She is not, she answers things very directly. And it's not always what you want to hear. So she and the remaining staff of the NEA will be shaping that agency. In terms of what advocacy for that looks like, National Association or National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, as well as the Americans for the Arts, are very actively having this conversation. They are talking to folks that are inside the NEA. There are conversations going on amongst all of the national arts organizations. So the League of American Orchestras, Dance USA, Opera USA, Theater Communications Group, right? If there is an art form, there is somebody nationally representing that art form at the table. National Independent Venues Associations, American Presenters Alliance, right? Like all of these organizations are having these conversations about advocacy and how to move forward. It's a lot of folks in a room. There's a lot of opinions, but yes, the NEA and the NEH are going to probably look very different in the next few years than they have looked over the last 60. But that doesn't necessarily, that might not be all bad. There were things now that might be able to get fixed, and there are advocacy that's going to be happening. It is not ending in the next few weeks. It is going to probably take place over the next year as these federal agencies reshape. It's a very long answer to that question. I apologize.
I think that's all we had from Facebook.
Okay.
The
Well,
delay is considerable, though, so you might
Yeah.
want to.
Given it just a
We're going to
few
hang
more
in for another
minutes.
5 minutes. So if you are on Facebook, please type in your questions if you have them.
I do encourage everyone, like I said, to go to artsnc.org, check out those advocacy resources, as well as checking out the Americans for the Arts and Americans for the Arts Action Fund. All of those are going to be really great resources. And again, those yes, there's similar emails that they're all designed to be slightly different messages, so they work well together. It doesn't have to be an either or option. Well, I really do appreciate everybody making the time and taking the time to come out and learn about this. I know that information is probably one of the best things we can do and we can share, is make sure everybody knows what's going on. And I really appreciate you all for investing that time. Also, this will be on Facebook Live, so feel free to go on to Facebook and share that out. Like it, love it, give it big hugs. But anything we can do to kind of get the information out so that folks are aware of what's going on. Excellent. Well, Christine,
And
I think
it
we
will
can.
also be on our website. As soon as the captions are added, we have a webinar archive where you can go back and look at all of the webinars that we've had recently. And this one will be up as soon as we get the video processed.
Excellent. Absolutely. So definitely check us out at artsnc.org. And if you'd like, go to thecreativestate.org and look at getting an ArtsNC license plate, because that's how we have a paid lobbyist at the North Carolina General Assembly. So anyway, everybody, thank you all so very much. Have a great Wednesday. And again, I really appreciate your time and your advocacy.